So good morning, everyone. We are at the top of the hour on September 15th. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Maggie Dixon. I am the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative Development Coordinator at Prevent Child Abuse New York. And the HBCI is a federally funded project that's intended to be a forum for collaboration and cross-program coordination. And a component of that is our webinar series, where we offer information and a place where folks can get together and learn and talk with each other. So I just have a few housekeeping items before we dive in and I introduce our speakers. First off, this meeting does have closed captioning services available. If you head to the bottom of your screen and hover over the closed caption button, there's a CC button and you can either show or hide the subtitle. We ask that everybody stays muted to just keep the focus on our presenters. Also, this webinar series is recorded. So it will be put up on our website, and in the follow-up email, when you registered, I have a list of folks who registered and I have all of your emails. I'll send an email with a link to the recording, some supplemental materials, so a copy of the slide deck or any other resources, and a link to a follow-up survey. So the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative, as I mentioned, is a federally funded project, and a component of the PDGB5 grant is data collection. So we ask that folks please fill that out so we can continue to make these webinars possible. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today, Claire and Elizabeth. We're also joined by Bea as well, the producer from CAI, which is a nonprofit dedicated to improving the quality of healthcare and social services delivered to marginalized populations worldwide. So I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves and their roles in just a moment, but I'd just like to say the HBCI is so grateful to be joined by these new partners, and this should be a really wonderful and informative session. So Claire and Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Maggie. It's great to see so many faces and names joining us today. As Maggie mentioned, my name is Elizabeth. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a project director at CAI. And I work alongside of a lot of school-based health center staff in New York City, training them on sexual and reproductive health topics, as well as mental health. And previously to joining CAI, I worked as a social worker doing short-term mental health counseling with adults and adolescents. So I'm really excited to be here with all of you and engage in this conversation about working with teen parents. And I have my co-trainer, Claire, introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire Friedrich. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the project director at CAI of a maternal infant health project in New York City. I also have been working in clinical settings and community-based health settings for many years with parents of all ages. So I'm also excited to join the conversation today.
Great, thank you. And so we're here talking about what are some effective strategies in working with teen parents and understanding adolescent development. So as a result of today's webinar, we hope that you will be able to identify adolescents' developmental stages, explain how adolescent development and brain development impact health behaviors, and finally apply adolescent development to day-to-day work with parenting teens. And to get us started, we're going to start by doing a little icebreaker activity using an app called Poll Everywhere, or a website called Poll Everywhere, to do a little bit of word cloud. So I want us to get back into thinking of our own teenage years. What is one word that reminds you of when you were a teenager? What is a word that reminds you of your own teenage years? Thank you, Bethany. I see you putting in the chat. We're going to use this and put it into a word cloud. So I'll have my producer B kind of highlight how to put them in so we can see this word cloud appear.
Great. So in order to respond to the word cloud, you have two options. You can either go to pollev.com/CAI050 and put in your responses, or join by text by texting CAI050 to the number 37607. I'm going to go ahead and put those instructions in the chat as well.
And thank you all for those who've chatted in. I love seeing these responses. We'd love for you to put them into the word cloud so we can kind of see it come alive on the screen. And for those who don't know, a word cloud, as words are repeated, that word gets bigger. And so it's sometimes really nice to see what are the common themes of our own teenage years. And I'm loving what people are saying in the chat and in the word cloud. Dramatic, that's a big one. Irresponsible. Free, I love that. Uncertain. Insecurities, these are great. I know a lot of people wrote fun in there. A lot of feeling words I'm seeing. Depressed, anxious, impulsive, busy, wild from Haley. Love that. So keep putting him into the word cloud, and I'm just going to ask, as we're watching it grow and change, what is this like to remember and think about your own teenage years? What comes up for you as you're thinking about this? I love rebellious being a big word in there. Alyssa, thank you. I wouldn't want to do it again. Same, I agree. So yeah, you know, it reminds us maybe how challenging of a time it was for ourselves. You know, that all these feelings and probably for me, all of these words were really relevant as a teenager, right? So that, you know, my friends were super important to me, says Heather, right? So all these things, you know, that we think about teenagers and how we were feeling, how can we relate that to the teenagers, the teen parents, and that we work with now? And so to get us started, we're going to think about, you know, how we can connect with adolescents from our past experience. And so I'm going to pass it over to Claire, and we're going to talk about, you know, the stages of adolescent development. So thank you for engaging in this word cloud. We can take a screenshot of that at some point and send it all to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I liked seeing the word confusing kind of shift shapes, getting bigger and smaller, because as confusing as teen or adolescent years can be for them, they're equally confusing for us as we work with adolescents. So we're going to kick things off and take a look at some images. I think when we look at younger ages, we see infants, we see toddlers, and we see preschoolers as three really distinct stages, right? The difference between a 3-month-old and a 3-year-old is vast. They're different people. And yet we don't do the same thing with adolescent years. We often just sort of group them together. So we're going to walk through the 3 stages of adolescence, and then we're going to sort of do some work through one adolescent in particular to begin to understand what's going on and what's changing in their bodies and in their brains. So when we're working with adolescents, we really do need to consider the 3 different stages of early, middle, and late adolescence so that we can really tailor our approach when we're working with them appropriately. We need to try to determine the stage of adolescent development that somebody's in. And when we do this, we tend to jump to some of those more surface level things like physical attributes. Some physical attributes we can see, some are a little bit harder to see. But just as an example, we might see a girl in early adolescence who already has started to develop breasts and may sort of group her in our heads, in our minds, as someone who falls into that late adolescence stage, which is not necessarily appropriate. We know that this is not always true, that someone's physical attributes match up with what in our heads we assume to be early, late, or early, middle, or late adolescence. Similarly, we might work with folks in later adolescence and assume that they're less likely to get pregnant because they seem to be able to make different decisions. And yet this is where we see the highest rates of unintended pregnancies. So it works both ways. It's important to really recognize that how one works with an early adolescent is going to be drastically different in some ways than how they might work with somebody who's in their late adolescence. I also just want to note before we go to the next slide, this age span, we really don't see that until the age of 26 or even a bit beyond that, that the brain really does stop that developmental period. So it extends well beyond teen years, even though we'll sometimes kind of use these terms of teen and adolescent interchangeably. So we're going to walk through the various domains that are also really important to understand as we're talking about adolescent development. So on the next slide, we're going to see this pie with 6 different slices. And we're going to consider the physical development, cognitive development, identity, integrity, intimacy, and independence. And understand, I'll probably repeat this a few times, that adolescents may be much more mature or developed in one slice of the pie than they are necessarily in another slice of the pie. So I'm going to briefly define each of these, and then we'll take this through a real story. So when we're talking about physical development, I think this is the piece that most of us understand and have experienced for all of the angst and confusion and fun that goes with it. These are the physical changes in the body and in the brain. When we look at the cognitive development slice of the pie, we're talking about changes in reasoning, concepts, memory, and language. When we look at that identity slice, this is that examination of or forming of beliefs and goals and values. And this is where some of those really big, tough questions come up. Who am I? Who do I want to be? How do I fit into society? In looking at that next slice, integrity, this is the beginning of understanding and developing and clarifying our values. In intimacy, this is about investing in connection and commitments to other, forming loving relationships, deep friendships. And in the independent slice, perhaps the most iconic slice as we think about adolescence, this is where folks start to require more privacy. They start to demand that need to do things in their own way, which often runs counter to how mentors or parents might wish things were done. And they're building in self-sufficiency here. So again, by gaining an understanding of how adolescents act or why they act in a particular way, why they behave in a way that they do, we can take better care of them. And it's important that we don't take their behaviors personally when we're working with them. We need to understand it's just developmental. And the things that they're doing are actually quite normal for their developmental stages, even if they're wildly frustrating to us. So early adolescents think in very concrete terms. They may see the world in pretty black and white terms, and often have an inability to plan way off into the future. So this is almost a verbatim conversation I had with my nearly 10-year-old who's not quite into that early adolescent phase this morning. Rather than asking, is your backpack ready? I may have to go through some concrete steps of, is your water bottle ready? Do you have your homework folder? So I've got to walk through some specifics rather than thinking big picture. Middle adolescents are more focused on themselves. They have that kind of, I know everything vibe, I can't get hurt, I'm invincible mentality. And then in the later stages of adolescence, that feeling of rebellion starts to wear off a little bit for many. They're more capable of setting some reasonable goals, to be thinking about the future. It's less all about me. And we see some longer term relationships forming in this stage as well. So as I said earlier, it's important to remind oneself that somebody might be more developed in one or two of these spheres than necessarily other parts of these spheres. So we're going to do a deeper dive into each of these domains, and we're going to start with the physical domain. So we're going to look at each of these domains in each of the 3 phases or stages of adolescence through the eyes of our friend Daniela. So at 12 years old, Daniela was feeling a little bit like a late bloomer. She was twiggy, she had awkwardly big feet, she had a retainer. A lot of the girls in her class had already gotten their period, and even though the idea sort of creeped Daniela out a little bit, she also didn't want to be the last person in her class to get her period. Daniela's older cousin gave her some of her old bras, which it seemed like she needed more and more every day. She was also playing a lot with fashion and makeup, trying to look and feel older. She spent more and more time in front of the mirror, applying makeup to her chin to cover blemishes, and smacking candy-smelling lip gloss on her lips. So we can see here in the early stages, this is the onset of puberty. There's this kind of liminal phase of being between childhood and adulthood, and it's confusing. There's a lot more experimentation happening as that identity is forming as well, and how that matches up with identity. So fast forward a few years, by 15, Daniela was no longer the skinny kid that she was at 12. She'd put on some weight in her butt and in her legs, and she was no longer getting along with the bras that her cousin had given her. Even though she loved to show off some parts of her body with tighter clothes, she was also constantly scrutinizing her body, watching videos about special juices and 7-minute magic exercises so she could lose belly fat. She noticed the ways that boys were checking her out, but she also was watching with horror about how these boys would talk about other women's bodies. We see body changes are in full swing in this middle stage of adolescence. Oftentimes there are feelings of sexual feelings for other people really developing in full force, and many teens are sexually active in their middle adolescent years. So we'll jump once again a few years forward to when Daniela is 20. She's got her fashion and grooming routines down pat at this age after years of figuring out her personal style. She's worn the same sizes for the last 4 years, which means that her stuff lasts longer. She's more confident about showing off what she considers to be her physical assets, and she pays close attention to articles and YouTube videos and TikTok on how she can dress for her body type. She always wants to look her best, regardless of whether she's headed into work or school or if she's out on a date. So we can see here also there's a greater sense of self-control, really coming into ourselves and self-image at this age. Also, sexual behavior is more prominent in this late stage of adolescence. So let's take a look at the next domain and dive a bit deeper into this cognitive wheel or slice of the wheel. So Daniela had become more self-sufficient when she was in the 7th grade. Her dad gave her really specific instructions for how she could take the bus home from school, which was about a 20-minute ride from home. She'd become very comfortable in doing this either on her own or going with one of her best friends from the same neighborhood. She did often forget to check in with her dad after work after she got home though, despite his instructions that she'd check in each afternoon just to let him know that she'd gotten home safe. Again, going back to this idea of really concrete thinking, many early adolescents are focused on what's happening here and now, and they don't have that abstract ability to really think into the future or think about what might other people be thinking is happening if I'm not communicating with them. So by the time Daniela hit the age of 15, she was able to figure out some more sophisticated routes to be able to get around town, meet up with her friends. She also had her first cell phone by this age, and she was better about texting her dad her whereabouts. There were still times, though, where she'd get invited to go somewhere and completely drop the ball in terms of communicating with her dad. And she often came home a lot later than she thought she'd be home because she was miscalculating how long it actually took to get home. While her dad tended to imagine the worst, Daniela's eye rolls were on point at this age because she thought that his overprotective nature was frankly just really annoying. So we do see that abstract thinking becoming a bit more sophisticated, definitely in that know-it-all stage, feeling that nothing bad can happen to me. I know what I'm doing. So now that Daniela is 20 in her late adolescence, she's still living at home with her dad while she works part-time at the front desk of a pediatrician's office. She's also in school studying to become a medical assistant. And she's had time to sort of figure out how to manage her work-life balance, her school calendars, to try to see friends, and also help out with cooking a couple meals each week when her dad has to work late. We see her future goals are a bit more realistic, and she's able to balance all these components of her life. So let's jump to this fun slice of identity. At 12, Daniela had a lot of time to stare at classmates and wonder how she fit into the social scene at school. She's asking these questions that, frankly, some of us are still asking. Am I normal? How do I fit in? She was the type to quietly observe in environments where she wasn't as confident. School was definitely one of those places where she was not as confident. She watched how some of the more popular girls dressed. She tried to style herself in the same way. And when her dad teased her about trying out a new look, she got really irritable, as if he was the one to try to police how she dressed. So we see in these earlier years of adolescence, folks looking outside of their family for who they want to identify with, how they want to dress, how they want to look. They're looking for that self-definition from anybody but mom or dad. By 15, Daniela was firmly in the camp of wanting to dress like all of her friends, sharing makeup tips, spending weekends dyeing their hair, going to vintage shops to find clothing. She was really into long necklaces that would draw attention to her breasts because she got a different kind of attention from boys and men compared to what she did a year or two ago. She'd had some pretty serious arguments with her dad, who didn't love this attention-seeking behavior. And she'd also had some arguments with some of her friends who thought maybe she was trying to distract their boyfriends. So we see how important peers are. I saw in the word cloud and in the chat, many people commenting about how much friends are everything at this stage. They're helping make up our minds about what's cool at this age. This is an age of, I know best, pretty egocentric. And things can change fast from day to day, from group to group, from who one is hanging out with. Now at 20, Daniela's friends still definitely have some influence on how she spends her free time, how she dresses, but it's not the same way as how it was in high school. She's much busier working, she's going to school, she has these other identities. She's much more clearly imagining herself in the healthcare profession, maybe at some point becoming a nursing student. So we do see some decrease in how much that peer identity forming matters in quite the same way. And Daniela is really seeing herself as an adult. So she's moving out of that younger territory. She definitely identifies that way. Let's flip forward to the next domain of integrity. 12-year-old Daniela was pretty responsible. As I mentioned, she's a pretty self-sufficient person most of the time. She felt like her dad was always on top of her with all the rules, making her call him, it seemed like every 5 seconds when she got home from school, when she thought her friends never had to do that. Even though her dad talked about maybe getting Daniela a cell phone by the time she got to high school, she had nearly put a stop to that conversation a few times when she exploded and pushed back so hard. He kind of lost his patience and told her to just forget about ever getting a cell phone while she was living under his roof. It wasn't like she could just step back and try to look at why he worried so much about his 12-year-old daughter. So we see this beginning of questioning parents' values, still, again, back to that concrete black and white kind of thinking about right and wrong. Boundaries we know are very, very necessary. And just like with our the image of the infant, toddler, and preschooler. We know why boundaries are so important. And we know that when adolescents or 3-year-olds are pushing against those boundaries, there's so much learning and there's so much integrity building happening. By the age of 15, Daniela's biggest home life stressor was her dad's rules about everything. So we see this is continuing. He'd threatened to stop paying for the phone plan if she forgot one more time to text him when she got home from school. She yelled at him about not trusting her, not being grateful that she'd made dinner 2 weeks ago without screwing anything up, about not giving her space just to breathe in her own house. This was happening almost every time Daniela's dad called her out about not doing something that she was supposed to do. So we see this increase in testing the boundaries, pushing those buttons, rejecting, seems like some days everything that parents are expressing as a value set. So there's just a lot of drama, a lot of friction happening in this stage. But at 20 today, Daniela has a little bit more of that life perspective to see why her dad was always on the slightly overprotective side. She sees how a few friends of hers from high school who didn't have those kinds of boundaries, from her perspective now, seemed like they'd kind of drifted. They'd started partying too hard. They didn't really know what they wanted in life. Daniela is a hardworking student, but she's also stressed out. She's got schoolwork, she's got exams, she's working 15 hours a week, she's helping out at home. So when she does meet up with friends, she tends to drink pretty hard. She ends up sometimes crashing at a friend's house or going home with people. So there's still some inconsistency. We may have a value set and drift away from that. These internal controls are based on some more refined or defined moral principles, and that development is still in the works. Let's take a look at the intimacy domain. So 12-year-old Daniela has a small group of best friends that she's known since elementary school, and that group's expanded once she started middle school. Although Daniela's friends mostly get along, there definitely was some occasional 7th grade drama as Daniela was navigating different interests. Some of the girls seemed more mature, were showing more interest in boyfriends, and showing less and less interest in school, which was problematic for this pretty self-sufficient, good student that Daniela was. So we see a lot of intimacy still defined by friends and peer groups in this early adolescence. This is an age of major clickiness. So at 15, Daniela was going out with Adrian, a senior at another high school. Her friends still hung out with Daniela at school. They'd often meet up on weekends, but Daniela reserved most of her free time for Adrian. Her dad didn't love that Daniela spent so much time with this boyfriend, but he was respectful enough. He could see Daniela was pretty happy. We see a lot of pairing off happening at this stage if we look at that middle category. So friends and peers are still really the core of life, and this can expand into a more singular love object. So boyfriends, girlfriends can take on a lot more prominence and importance in this stage. By 20, though, Adrian is old history. Daniela was so busy with school and with work, she really doesn't have as much time for anything serious. She loves to go to clubs with friends. She likes to keep things really casual, hooking up with men or women. They never tend to last more than a few weeks, if that. It's usually a lot more flirtatious texting because that's what she feels like she has the time for. And it seems like it's the same thing that a lot of people that she meets are looking for these days, nothing super serious. So in this later phase of adolescence, there's more stability in some relationships, but we do see some fleeting relationships or just sort of different boundaries around what relationships mean. And it does tend to be more, tends to be less about that all about me. So right in here, there's more of that sense of mutuality in pairs. All right, let's look at that favorite slice of the pie for adolescents around independence. So as you've gathered, when Daniela was 12, her little pot of friends meant everything to her. She was gaining independence and really figuring out her place in the world. She still relied a lot on her dad for certain things. There were many times where it felt like she and her dad were on this emotional roller coaster. She was testing his limits. She was establishing her own. He knew it was important to give some time and space to grow up. He'd been a teen too, but it was really painful to do so. And sometimes it did feel to him like he was losing his little girl. In this earlier phase where Daniela was, this is that need for privacy is big. And again, I named that tricky space between childhood and adulthood where teens and adolescents still need those mentors. They need those adult relationships, and they need to push right up against them as well. By 15, Daniela was pretty responsible at school, but she seemed to save up all that angst and rebellion for her dad, who felt like, she felt like he was always nagging, always asking too much of her, like the texting after school every single day. She found every button to push. Her dad knew that this nagging wasn't getting him anywhere, but he was kind of at a loss, frankly, for what else to do. They couldn't talk the way that they used to. This is that classic rebellion stage. Now that Daniela's 20, she and her dad have established a pretty good rhythm and a routine at home with each other. She's gone much of the time. She's not at home as much while she's working, while she's in school or out with friends. And when she is home, she's got her own space in their apartment, and she tends to keep the place pretty tidy. She's helping out with meals, as I mentioned. It sometimes feels more like she's a roommate than a daughter. As she's juggling the balance of so many competing priorities, her dad is pretty forgiving when she stresses out and she can't handle something like prepping dinner, a task that ordinarily she doesn't have a big problem with. After all, she's still 20. So we see this psychological division between mom and dad becoming more complete, and a much more self-sufficient stage. So understanding these different domains not only helps us to care better for our clients, for those that we're working with, but it also helps to tailor the way that we communicate and, of course, understand adolescents appropriately. So we will be sharing some resources and information, some guidelines on communication techniques when working with teens in these different stages. But again, remember that this extends farther than a lot of us are sort of classically thinking about those adolescent years. So definitely folks in their early to mid 20s still fall into that late adolescence period. So feel free to chat in comments or questions about the information. But what we're going to do is sort of take this example and take these different markers of early, middle, and late adolescence and apply it through some examples told through some poll questions. So I'm going to ask in just a moment, B's going to launch our first poll. So after reading the scenario that you'll see, you're going to determine which stage you think each of these youth would be placed. So you'll mark off early, middle, or late adolescence. And for this activity, think of developmentally appropriate adolescent behavior. We know that these behaviors can look different for young people who've experienced trauma or substance use or abuse, which we'll also get into today. So we'll consider these situations in more detail, but we really just want you to, again, be thinking about developmentally appropriate behaviors. So let's look at this first poll with Shailene. Shailene is an adolescent parent you work with. She has a hard time talking about the future. She isn't that focused on furthering her education or getting her baby into daycare. All she talks about is what's happening today and this weekend. It's really frustrating. What stage of development do you think Shailene is in? So we'll give you 30 seconds or so. Go ahead and answer in. We'd love full participation, so I can see a good number of you responding. You should be able to just click that right on your screen. Great. I see over half of you who've already participated. This is great.
And just a few more seconds for your last answers.
Thank you, B. All right. So we'll share those results. We can take a look at a good spread here, right? These are not so straightforward always to think about. What's developmentally appropriate? So I see about a quarter of people guessed that this was an early stage of adolescence. A bit over half of you guessed middle, and about 10% guessed that this was late. So we see a good spread here. Feel free to chat in if there's a reason that you felt pretty strongly that this was one versus another stage. I'm curious to see, what sorts of information in the scenario helped you decide on which stage to choose. Is there anything that really stuck out? The thinking day by day, that inability for future planning. Okay. Not being able to think too far into the future. Yeah. Hard to think about the future, mainly concerned with what everyone's up to, what they're doing. Yeah. So, of course, we can see some run over between these two, but this is actually an example of early adolescence. So, folks mentioned this focus on the here and now, the inability to do too much of the future planning. Those weekend vibes are there. Somebody just commented on. So there's not a whole lot of clarity or interest in being able to focus on goals or plans. So great. It's really great to see how folks are thinking about this and applying these to the different stages. As I said, these are not so easy. So we're gonna have a chance to do this with several other polls. We've got 5 other scenarios to run through. So let's take a look at this second example of Samantha. So Samantha is one of your clients who's about to give birth. Every time you meet with her, you feel like it's a battle. No matter what you say or suggest about things like saving up for formula or getting things ready for her baby, she just says you're stressing her out. She's resistant to any advice or guidance that you offer. What stage of development do you think Samantha might be in? Is she in early, middle, or late? I see a question about, just to clarify, the last example of Shailene, that was in early adolescence. We're launching the poll for Samantha here. Go ahead and respond if you think Samantha is in early, middle, or late. I don't see a poll coming up either. Give us a moment to launch that.
Claire, would you be able to try to launch that poll? I'm experiencing an error I haven't seen before on my end. Or Maggie.
I'm taking a look. One moment.
I'm having the same error. So we'll give this one more shot and then we'll get creative.
I just launched poll 2.
All right, thanks for your patience. I'm seeing a lot of people chatting in, which is a great way to pivot. So let's look at what folks are chatting in. I know we lose the anonymity feature, but I appreciate everybody's responses. So again, I'm seeing a mix of some early, middle, with a focus on rebellious. Lots of early and middle responses here. I'm thinking middle. Great. So from what I can gauge without exact data in front of me, those of you who answered middle are spot on. So I saw in your texts or in your chats some of the reasons focused that you were sort of thinking that this might be more of that middle stage. So I saw the classic rebellion come up, that resistance to advice from older people or from authority figures, that friction. That's that classic middle stage, which can be a lot of fun and a lot of frustration. So those of you who guessed middle for Samantha are correct. This would be a classic middle adolescence. All right, let's take a look at the third one. We can give the poll a try, and if it doesn't work, we'll move ahead with just chatting those responses in. So Marcy is a client you've been working with for a year. She started dating Carter 3 months ago. All Marcy wants to talk about is Carter. Every decision she makes, she wants to consult Carter. They text each other constantly. So what stage of development do you think Marcy is in? B, are we still having issues with the same poll?
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right, thanks for your patience, folks. So I see people chatting in their responses, which is great. Thank you for doing that. Chat in, do you think it's early, middle, or late? And while you're chatting things in, if you want to provide a little rationale, what sorts of tidbits from the scenario are making you justify that answer? These are not always super clear cut, but we're looking for some bigger trends. So overall, again, I'm seeing a lot of that middle, and oh, now I'm seeing a poll 1 appear on my screen. There, we've got that third. Sorry, folks, we're jumping around. But again, if you want to answer in, we'll give this about 10 more seconds. We can always refer to the chat and the poll. It's a Wednesday. Zoom feels like it's a Wednesday today too. All right, we see a good response here. I've got about 2/3 of folks who have voted in. So if you want to give that 5 more seconds and we'll close it. So once again, this is a middle adolescent scenario. So those of you, the bulk of you guessed middle, and I can certainly see reasons why people would edge towards early or late. These are not, these are not as black and white as often our earlier middle adolescents are thinking in. But again, that focus on the love interest. Some of you put that love object as your rationale. The boyfriend is the center of her universe. So again, this is a classic example of middle adolescence. Let's jump quickly to the 4th scenario. So Brielle is a client that you're currently working with. She's been missing her 6-month-old son's doctor's appointments. And even though she tells you that she wants you to, go with her to these appointments, she also seems to get annoyed with your text reminders. So what stage of adolescence do you think Brielle is in? Early, middle, or late? So you should see that poll on your screen. Go ahead and vote in. I love how quick the sponge is. We've got nearly half of you voting in. Great, we'll give you just a couple more seconds. All right, let's close that poll. We've got a nice bunch of you voted in. All right, so I see about 15%, 16% of you who have voted in early. Once again, I see middle as the big category. So nearly 60% have chosen middle, and about 1/4 of you guessed that this was a late stage. These are tricky. I can't overemphasize that. So what information in the scenario, if you want to quickly chat in any ideas that clued you into this being one adolescent phase or another, or stage or another, what sorts of things made you think it was early, middle, or late? I should ask too, if you're chatting those things in, if you want to put, I thought it was early because ... so we can connect that. These are anonymous. Anything that made you think this was early, middle, or late? Thinking late, she knows what's, see, I lost that. She knows what she should be doing. She recognizes the need for support, can identify wants and needs, but unable to follow through. So a lot of folks are guessing late. This actually is an early adolescence example. So she is really unable to function independently when it comes to some of those longer term planning things, things like keeping appointments. She kind of rebels against guidance and helpful reminders. So I can see why some of you were pushing her into more of that middle or late category as well. But she is not a super self-sufficient person at this age. And again, we do want to consider that she may be much more developed or advanced, we might call it, in some spheres, but not as much in other categories. So great. We've got just 2 more polls for you. So we'll jump to the 5th scenario. Again, that last scenario was early adolescence. So let's look at Tiana. Tiana is a client in your caseload. She spends a lot of time with her group of friends, and it seems to be her main source of connection. Several of her friends also have young babies, so they like to meet at the playground or outside one of their apartments. Tiana takes a lot of pride in being kind of the planner of the bunch, and she sets up a lot of their play dates. So what stage of development do you think Tiana might be in? Folks might be seeing the same thing I'm seeing, which is a blank. Again, Zoom seems to be having some hiccups. If you're seeing that poll, you can respond in. Otherwise, if you want to chat in, we can do this both ways. I think Tiana is in early, middle, or late adolescence.
I don't see blank. I'm happy to read off percentages if you can't see, Claire.
Sure.
So right now, oh.
Have we closed the poll?
Yep, it's just closed.
Great. Yeah, if you could read those off, Maggie, I'm seeing a blank again, so that would be super helpful.
Okay, so we have about 8% of folks say early, about a quarter, just over a quarter, so 27% say middle stage, and the majority, so 65% say late.
Great, thank you. Those of you who said late, what sorts of things perked your ears in this scenario to make you think it was late? And spoiler alert, you're right. This is a late adolescent phase. So what sorts of things did you see? Elizabeth, can you read off some of the things that are coming in through the chat for me?
For sure, yeah. People are saying that she takes pride in being a planner, that she's a leader, that she likes to plan and has realistic relationships with friends, taking that initiative and follow through. So definitely.
Perfect. Yeah, so peers are super important. She's seeing herself as kind of the leader of this group of peers. They're a very stable aspect of her life. There's that sense of mutuality, of looking out for one another, sharing of relationships between two or more people. So those were great responses. So Tiana is in this later stage of adolescence. Thanks for your help, Elizabeth. So we're going to look at our final scenario with Diamond. Diamond is one of your all-time favorite clients. What's perplexing to you is how distracted she is at times. Yesterday, she texted that she was completely out of diapers for her daughter. She forgot to mention this at her appointment with you the day before. In what stage of development do you think Diamond might be in? Early, middle, or late? Get those responses in, and I'll ask Maggie to share those with me as soon as we close the poll.
So we have about half of folks' answers in. I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds for your last answers.
Great.
We're going to go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, so we have majority of folks saying early, 58%. About 30% say middle and 11% say late.
Fantastic. All right. Once again, what sorts of things, for those of you who voted in early, what sorts of things made you think that Diamond might be in that earlier stage of adolescence? And if Elizabeth can help me out one more time.
Of course, yeah, we already got something from Maria saying the lack of planning and day-by-day thinking made her choose early development.
Great. Yeah,
There's a couple others. Candace saying that she forgot the Pampers or that forgetfulness, so maybe more middle. I get of a more late, irresponsible adult, lack of ability to plan ahead. So those are all the things that people are pulling out of that scenario.
Yeah, all true. She's a little bit of a space cadet, right? That forgetfulness, that inability to remember sort of concrete things. Put Diamond in an early stage of adolescence. So those of you, I think the bulk of you who voted in early were correct. This can trickle into that middle phase, absolutely. So again, to wrap up these scenarios, we really want to be thinking about how understanding these developmentally appropriate stage behaviors within the stages of adolescence can inform our work with adolescent parents and think about how we can help take care of families. So in order to make sure everybody's getting their 4 or 5 servings of science that they require every day, I'm going to turn things over to Elizabeth for our next section.
Great, thanks Claire, and thanks all for your participation so far. We're now going to jump into thinking about the brain development. And before we get into talking about the brain science piece of that, we're going to do a quick activity. So if you have a pen and paper available to you, I'd love for you to take that out. And just take the piece of paper and number 1 through 6 on it. 1 through 6. And what we're going to do is I'm going to put up a screen with some scenarios. I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to answer yes or no and just write it down. You don't have to share it in the chat. You don't have to share it with anybody else, but just write down for you, is it a yes or no? Okay, so let's look at the first scenario. We have, you've had a really bad day at work. It's your first week of the school year and lots of foster care youth have shown up to see you. You are also behind with your paperwork. You feel tired and overworked. On your way home, you notice a great sweater in your favorite color just calling your name. Do you buy it, yes or no? Scenario number 2, you're in your supervisor's office for a meeting. You notice she has a stack of staff performance evaluations on her work table. She is called out of the office for a moment. You would like to take a quick look at some of those evaluations. Do you look? Yes or no? Scenario 3. You've been working hard to lose some weight. One of your coworkers has made some homemade brownies and you're in that 3 p.m. slump. The brownies look fantastic. Do you eat one? Yes or no? Scenario 4. You've been working hard to save for a family vacation. You've been paying close attention to extra spending and not eating out. It's been a long day at work and you're exhausted. The thought of going home and making dinner is overwhelming. You pass by the neighborhood Italian restaurant you know your family enjoys. You don't have extra cash and would have to dip into the vacation fund. Do you dip into the fund, yes or no? Scenario 5, your 16-year-old son comes home from a party with friends very drunk. Your partner is asleep and your son begs you not to tell them. He promises never to do again. Do you tell your partner, yes or no? Scenario 6, you have reconnected with your first serious boyfriend or girlfriend on Facebook. You've been sending messages back and forth and catching up on your lives. They share that they have never stopped thinking of you and suggest that you meet for coffee. Do you go, yes or no? All right. So this was a little activity we really enjoyed to do with all of you, and I'd love to hear from folks. What was it like to do this? Go through these 6 scenarios. You don't have to share your answers with me. Maggie saying it was a little tricky. Jasmine says it got her thinking. Jasmine, speak to me. What was getting you thinking? Or other folks, what made you think in this scenario or in this activity? Kathy also really had to think. Maria saying that impulse versus rationality. Alyssa saying I mostly have self-control. That's great, yes. Betsy, loving this graphic. Sarah, there was that time of like, sometimes you weren't sure, but I didn't really give you much of a chance to think about it more in depth, right, Sarah? You know, you had to answer quickly. David is saying it was relatable. Love this. Notice that I still have a sense of impulsivity from teen years. Yes, Bethany, me too. I'm always going to go for those brownies. That it was relatable, definitely made me think, especially the scenario with the supervisor. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Things I never thought through before. Might not always think decisions through, exactly. There's a degree of impulsivity that still applies to me, but many questions didn't apply to your life. Yep. Level of priority and importance. Kathy, it sounds like you wanted more details, of course. I'm still impulsive. Yep, says Connie. Immediate gratification versus patience and self-control. These are great. So keep chatting them in. Yeah, so sometimes we struggle with these and how tricky it can be to make impulsive decisions, based on what we want and based on maybe what's reasonable and rational for our lives. And we're all adults here, right? Maybe some of us are still in that adolescence period, whether we're 26 plus, that late adolescence, but we know that as adults, we're still impulsive, right? And so this really relates to adolescence because we know in adolescence, there's that high level of impulsivity. And as adults, we have experiences, right? Like, I love what Kathy's saying, maybe only half the brownie. And maybe it's like, last time I know that, I ate the whole brownie and I didn't feel well afterwards. So we have that experience to go from as adults that let us know and help us to make decisions based on reason and rationality. And again, I see what someone else is saying, like the one time dip into the vacation fund to give yourself a break, but obviously constantly do this will destroy the fund and the vacation goal. So us as adults have that discipline, have that impulse control to say, okay, I could dip in this one time for dinner, but I want to make sure I'm staying on track with my goal. Definitely. So this can really also influence how we communicate with teen parents, right? We want to make sure that we're acknowledging where they are developmentally to have a conversation. And that can sometimes look like, what is really going to influence a teen to make a decision? Is it going to be the long-term consequences or their long-term goals? Probably not. It's probably going to be something more, is this going to be a reward for them in the here and now? And so that's how we can kind of think about where those conversations start from. How do we help motivate teenagers in what's important to them? And I love this picture here. I know someone commented on it already, but of course this is a cartoon. It's just fun to look at and think about these different areas and what really is occupying the space in the minds of our adolescents that we work with. And I love this yin yang, the love for parents, hate for parents, which is exactly what Claire was talking about when there's that push and pull of independence and dependence on them, right? That slamming and punching reflex, there's that self-image, and there's that tiny piece at the very back, that yellow piece, the memory for chores and homework. It's so small, right? And I know I can relate to that. I hated doing those. I would always pretend like, oh, I didn't know I had to do that chore when I was a teenager. And so now we can kind of just have this fun image and think about what is taking up the minds of our youth that we work with. So now let's talk more in depth about the teenage brain. So the brain undergoes significant changes that affects the teen's understanding of their self and the world around them. And so as teens move into adulthood, they face increased independence, right? We kind of push adolescents into independence as they get into adulthood, right? By whether they go to college, whether they start a job, whatever that is, that we're pushing them into that independence. They may have to make more decisions independently and major life transitions. However, the adolescent brain is often characterized by this impulsive and risk-taking behaviors. And this adolescent behavior is different than children and different than adults. And this has a lot to do with how the brain is developing. So the changes in the brain during adolescence really impact how teenagers experience emotions. There may be heightened emotions, heightened awareness of those emotions, response to reward stimulus. They're going to be much more excited about getting a reward than us as adults would be. The impulse control, that again, they're maybe more likely to eat all of the brownies that are on the plate that were left in the room versus just having one. And making decisions. So making decisions that are helpful and healthy for their development and behavior. So let's take a look at what the brain looks like. There's three main areas that I want to highlight. This back piece, which is the reptilian brain or the brain stem, is responsible for that automatic functioning, the breathing, body temperature, everything that we need to do to survive from birth, that is in full function. Then the next piece is that limbic brain or limbic system, which is also called the mammalian brain, and it's responsible for our emotional expression, our emotional regulation, where we feel the feelings. There's fear, anxiety, sadness, pleasure, etc. And then on the top, we have the neocortex or the prefrontal cortex, also called the primate brain. And that's really responsible for logic, reasoning, rationale, decision-making. And this is a part of the brain that's not fully developed until the mid to late 20s. Hence why adolescence goes up into that point. It's due to where the brain is developing. And so we know during adolescence, the limbic system is the portion of the brain that is most prominent. And that accounts for that emotional lability that characterizes adolescence. All those emotions that you mentioned in the word cloud, that's the limbic system being active. So that's that blue centerpiece in this brain image here. And we know that adults are able to keep their emotions more in check, right? When we may feel something inside, we know that we don't always have to express that in that same way we feel inside. We can keep that more in check based on reason. However, adolescents are more likely to respond in that raw emotion and really have that reward-related learning. So, they respond great to an allowance, right? Adolescents respond great to saying, hey, if you do this, you can get a prize, or you can, have some extra spending money. So they relate really well to reward-based learning. We dig a little deeper into the prefrontal cortex. This is that purple area in the brain on the screen right now, so that front part, that adults are more likely to be able to process emotions and have that cognitive and emotional control, be able to make decisions and use their judgment effectively. Whereas adolescents may struggle using sound judgment or may have trouble organizing multiple tasks. And just as Claire has been mentioning too, that these are maybe what's typical of adolescents. We know that there are adolescents that are able to manage multiple tasks. We know that there are teenagers and adolescents that can use sound judgment, maybe because they've been pushed into a role where they need to be more independent and need to be more adult-like. And at the same time, we can sometimes attribute that behavior of they're not making those decisions to maybe where their brain is developing. So when we think about this prefrontal cortex, I love this idea of, similar to the activity that we did, where adolescents are really going to want to purchase whatever, if they get an extra $20, they're going to want to go out and maybe buy something that they really love. Versus us as adults, we may weigh the pros and cons and decide whether or not it makes sense for us to buy something. So that's kind of that key piece in the prefrontal cortex. And to kind of, conclude and put this together and how this relates to the work that you all do, we know that the limbic system, so that reward-based learning, that emotion center, shows exaggerated activation, more so than in children and more so than in adults. So it's a super unique time in a person's development during adolescence that they're wired to seek out rewards, wired to take those risks. And we don't always have to see that as a negative thing, right? I think oftentimes we categorize adolescents as taking these risks and it's a bad thing. However, we know that because their prefrontal cortex isn't as strong necessarily as it is in adults, that they're more, heightened with that emotion and pleasure. So we can think about those high-risk behaviors as sometimes thinking about like, oh, are they going to engage in drinking or drugs or alcohol or sex, but we can also think about it as, having some positive risks that they're going to be taking, whether that's starting a new job or going to school, making new friends. asking someone out on a date. Those are all exciting experiences that adolescents may have that we want to foster. So thinking about how we can foster positive and helpful and healthy risk-taking versus, maybe some of that negative and high risk-taking that we often think about with adolescents. So Sarah, I had a client say that she was not getting out of the home visiting services. I felt like I struggled to get up with her. You want to say a little bit more about that, Sarah?
So yeah, she was 16 going on 17. She was expecting, and like I thought we were doing well, and then it felt like all of a sudden she just said to me, yeah, I don't think that, how did she put it? But it was something like, this doesn't feel like I'm getting anything out of it. And I was like, crap. Because I knew at that point I had already lost her. But I was kind of getting the feeling, but I didn't know if it was accurate. And I think obviously from sitting with you today, it very much is, that I felt like I couldn't, I guess, produce enough information where she could get that reward, to see the benefit. And I felt like I couldn't, you know what I mean? Almost keep up with her. I was like, I met with her on a weekly basis, which was fantastic. But when I meet with my 30-something-year-olds moms, just me meeting with them, is reward enough, right? Mm-hmm. But for her, after that, maybe in the beginning, it probably was okay, but then it very quickly lost its reward, I guess, is the way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a great example of the challenges of engaging with adolescents, especially adolescent parents, and not really feeling sure of what's going on. Maybe she's seeing you as this adult figure, authority figure that she doesn't want to have to.
Well, and that was the other thing too. I kept forgetting, that she was, and we're also in the middle of a pandemic too, right? So I'm like, well, what are things that you like to do? Okay, well, for the last year, we haven't been able to go out of her house, but then she's also more restricted because she is 15 or 16 and pregnant. You know what I mean? So I was asking her, and I'd ask her questions well, what do you like to wear? What do you like? And she couldn't answer that. Yeah. It was just definitely challenging, and it made me just rethink just a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes with adolescents, it can be helpful to what I call roll with the resistance, right? So they're going to just be there and pretend that they're cool and sit there. We can do the same thing. We can engage with them in a way that's kind of relating more at their level versus I'm here to tell you what to do,
Right. I did a lot of TV watching with her initially. And then I also, the time that we had together, so to talk about things, what I also did was we had started a collage. And so she would cut out things, but then I would use it as I'd go through it and I'm like, okay, if you had to pick a pair of boots to wear, would you pick this one or this one? You know what I mean? Or how would you dress your baby? Would you just run this? Just to get an sense of her. And that helped with just conversation. Plus it gave us something to do.
Yeah, that's great. Right. And that can kind of help spur some of that future thinking if she's not there yet. And I love what Carmen is saying in the chat, meeting them where they're at. Exactly. So, okay, you're not interested in chatting with me. That's okay. I'm not going to force you. And kind of giving that power. And then sometimes that even encourages them and makes them open up a little further. But I'd love to hear, I know I went through that quickly, that information around the brain. Are there other thoughts, questions, reactions to this information? Thank you again, Sarah, for getting us started with that. How might you use this information with the adolescents you're working with? Yeah, how do you balance giving them direction but not being overbearing? Such a great question, Alyssa. And yeah, it's such a tricky balance, right? And so maybe, I think going back to what Carmen is saying, we want to meet them where they're at. We also want to acknowledge where we're coming from and think about that the power differential in the room, that you're maybe meeting with an adolescent who sees you as an authority figure, and how can we kind of relate to them on their level so that they're not feeling like you're telling them what to do? How can we kind of, in a sense, we want to change the situation so that they feel like they're making the decision, that it's not just coming from you. So how can we encourage them? And that's a lot of using open-ended questions. It's affirming them, right? Those motivational interviewing skills we want to use so that they can hear themselves say that versus it just coming directly from you. What is your take on mirroring when it comes to adolescence? Tell me more about mirroring. I think I know what you mean, but. So I see Trina saying, seems super important. It still is for me as a middle-aged adult. Yep. Exactly, Trina, thank you. And Carmen, respect their space. How do you treat the rebellion when they think you are overbearing? I have Courtney saying, I have found this training very informative. Yes, we will send a PowerPoint to you. Don't worry about that. And yeah, I think, we really want to meet them where they're at. We'll send some other resources as well to talk about, how can we roll with that resistance when they're feeling rebellious? How do we kind of roll with them and say, okay, you're not interested in doing this? I'm not going to force you to do it, right? I think oftentimes we see adolescents see us as an authority figure and they automatically want to rebel, whether they agree with what we're saying or not. And so we want to think about, how we can, again, encourage them for it to come from them and not just a directive, right? No one really likes to be told what to do. Maria, mirroring their posture, voice, tone, level, excitement. Exactly. Super important, right? We want to be aware of their body image, our body language, and we also want to be aware of ours, and matching that can, again, reduce that level of power differentials and power imbalances. So I totally think that that's a great technique to use, especially when you're doing a home visit, right? So thank you for these questions. We'll have more time at the end for questions and other comments. I'm glad that this has been useful so far. I want to jump into some of the effects of childhood trauma. Being that you are in this field of preventing child abuse, I'm sure folks that you work with have experienced trauma, right? And so, what happens when you get stressed? What happens when you get overwhelmed? Things happen in our bodies, right? And there's changes that happen. And so what we know from research is that the brain adapts to an environment, whether that is positive or negative environment. And once it's removed from that environment, it continues to change and respond to the new environment. So I think I said it before, I'll say it again. What gets fired gets wired. So the paths in our brain that are continuously being used get wired in our brain. When youth experience abuse of any kind or a traumatic event, we know that it can lead to toxic stress. And what is toxic stress? It's that strong and prolonged activation of the body's stress response system. And that can really impact their development, both cognitively, socially, emotionally, and physically. It can have those negative health outcomes. If anyone's heard about the ACEs or ACE study, that came out with a lot of research that said how much adverse childhood experiences can impact our health. So toxic stress especially happens when youth experience abuse or violence that's perpetrated by their caregiver or the person that they're supposed to trust from a very young age. and over a long period of time. And we know that trauma can manifest in a lot of different ways among the clients you serve, right? So you might see adolescents that are lacking maturity. You may see adolescents with increased levels of depression or ADHD. We often see that. We may see poor school performance or someone that's really quick to anger. And there might also be physical health issues, and these can all be attributed to trauma. And again, just as the brain can be wired to expect a traumatic environment, it can also be rewired through trauma-informed services and having positive relationships. So we know that youth are resilient because they've survived so much. They can continue to grow and develop and learn. They're flexible, they're resilient. And it really only takes one healthy, supportive adult relationship for youth to begin to calm their nervous system down. So you being an adult that's supportive to them is really going to be a key component of their healing process. And we know that adolescence is the second most important time for brain development and where we see a ton of brain growth. The healthy adult relationships can help to buffer the effects of trauma on development because our brains are plastic. There's that neuroplasticity. Again, so what gets wired can get rewired. And with that being said, it takes time. We need to be patient, especially when we see something frustrating that the youth that we work with do. Even if they're saying, I don't really want to meet with you, like that's frustrating, especially if that's part of your job that you need to do. So how do we be patient and remember all of these different factors that may be impacting them? And so, again, a reminder that their behavior isn't to hurt or punish you, but it's them trying to make sense of the world, whether they've experienced trauma or not. And that's not necessarily the point of this, is to find out whether they've had trauma, but to really understand that trauma is common. And so we can offer empathy and understanding to youth that express distrust and distress, and that these emotions that they're expressing, that we want to acknowledge those. So we can use a strength-based approach by using some positive affirmations with our clients and creating a sense of safety. So whether that's physical safety and letting them know that they're safe physically, and emotional safety, that they're able to open up to you. And so this is just a brief synopsis of kind of how trauma and development go hand in hand. And I encourage you to continue learning about this, and I'm sure you all are. I know there's a ton of webinars that you've participated in, but I'd love to, to kind of continue that conversation at a later time. And now I'm going to pass it over to Claire to kind of finish off with a little teaser for a potential other webinar.
It's a perfect way to put it, Elizabeth, a little bit of a teaser. So I'm going to briefly touch on some thoughts and recommendations around engaging teen fathers. But before I do, I'd love if people could just chat in some of the thoughts you might have, comments you might have about how negative attitudes towards young men can have a negative effect on the services provided to them. So what comes to mind when you think about teen fatherhood? What are some of the sort of negative attitudes that I think many of us recognize as sometimes getting in the way? Immaturity, careless, the idea of irresponsible, hit it and quit it. They don't really want to be involved. Yeah. Selfishness, some fear around parenting. We see mom, we see that female figure often as the one who's taking on a lot of this onto their shoulders. Inability to express emotions. Yeah. So you're pointing out so many of the things that are nurtured or not nurtured oftentimes in men, boys. And I think that that's really important to think about, because it's also important to recognize that while it's certainly possible to have personal opinions and professional responsibilities be in conflict, it's also possible for us to be able to provide really quality services to teen fathers. There are lots of structural factors that many of you just pointed to, which can limit opportunities for engaging young men in that parenthood conversation. I'm glad Candace just pointed to the fact that trauma can have an effect as well. I think that this gets slipped under the rug, and it's very much why we built these portions to sort of follow each other. So thank you for pointing that out. You know, there are certainly some factors that are out of our control as community health workers, as social workers, as those working in the community with adolescents. But there are some that aren't necessarily outside of our control. So some examples of factors that might be beyond our control are things that are, you know, perhaps set by funders. So certain types of programs that are really only designed for girls or women. But some examples of factors that may be within our control are actually relatively simple. And they could be things like the hours of operation. When do we see clients? When do we reach out to clients? What are their schedules like? Thank you, Catherine, for bringing this up, that as a teen mom myself, I didn't feel that many programs tried to include my partner. And that's something that we see over and over, is a lack of engagement, which is exactly why we're talking about the need for engaging teen fathers and sort of getting over some of our own biases or some of those structural things that may be in place. So a lot of those factors have been shaped by the same sorts of attitudes and values and stereotyping that many of you chatted in. This idea that they may be more careless, or they may just not care about parenting. And we know that that's not true. So let's take a look at some of the top big three myths around engaging teen fathers. One big myth is that if fathers want to be involved in their children's lives, they just need to step up. And we know that this is really difficult because programs and staff may not feel supported or have the ability or be as thoughtful as we'd like them to be about how to engage and build programs for young boys and men. Oftentimes the parents of teen mothers are also really involved, and that can make it feel difficult for teen fathers to feel that they have a place to sort of edge in. A second big myth is that the system supports cohesive family units, when in actuality, as was just pointed out, programs that support women and children often leave fathers out completely. So they're not doing much to engage fathers. And a third myth is that human service agencies have the same level of commitment to the father as they do for the mother. And as many of you pointed out, this is not true. So there are fewer programs for teen fathers or fathers in general. Society often doesn't even consider fathers as big a piece of the picture, especially if they're not married. And the consequences for children and mother continue to contribute to and perpetuate a lot of the stigma. There's a lot of distrust in fathers. And so I wanted to certainly get a sense of what sorts of things you're seeing out there. I see another couple of chats that just came in. Sometimes it's a touchy subject because of ages of people and the law. Absolutely, we're talking about minors sometimes. Thank you also, Catherine. I can attest to that. I learned very much of my mom's knowledge to learn about how to be a mom versus taking his advice. And so it's cyclical. That's exactly it. It's cyclical. So let's take a look at some of the facts. We've already started to delve into this, but despite stereotypes, there is increasing evidence that teen fathers want to be involved with their children and are involved with their children. And this involvement doesn't always mean financial support. That's one of the first things our brains and cultures jump to, but it doesn't always mean that. And we can do a better job of engaging fathers and father figures. So we see here, involved dads improve their children's overall emotional and social well-being. And the absence of a biological father contributes to increasing risk of child maltreatment. So we're looking kind of globally at some of these. I know we could get much more nuanced about some of these facts, but it is important to bring up the health side of involving teen fathers and fathers in general. So very briefly, because we are ending here, I've kind of covered this, but let's take a look at the next slide with some recommendations, some really concrete things that folks can be doing. So our first recommendation is really to train staff to consider the father's perspective. So get some training around cultural humility, their upbringing of fathers, their education, their mental state. This is really going to inform, again, the ways in which we engage and communicate with fathers. It's also important to engage male staff members, not just as outreach workers, but on the leadership, because this is going to inform the kinds of programs that are developed. Create more father-friendly programs. I mentioned earlier, we can think about some of those things we do have control around, like the timing of events. What type of events are going to attract folks? Are we making food available? So that's one less thing they have to worry about. Are we really reaching out? We need to be investing in programs that provide services after normal business hours. So a 9-to-5 kind of program doesn't work for a lot of us anymore. The pandemic has certainly pointed to that. But we need to be thinking about evening hours. We need to be thinking about weekend activities. Maybe 8 a.m. events are not the best timing. And we really need to draw on the strengths of fathers. Consider them as resources, because they are. They are absolutely resources in children's lives, in mothers' lives. They can bring so much to our programs. And so it's a reframing. And I think a lot of that sort of cultural training that goes into staff-wide, organizational-wide level things can make a huge difference. So thank you for the affirmation from Leanna, who definitely shares our view that we need to be including them. At this point, we would love for folks to chat in any questions that might still be out there, and to chat in one pearl of wisdom that you're taking away with you. So what's one new thing that you might be pondering as you walk away from today's webinar with us? We'll give you a chance to chat those things in. Excited to see what people are thinking at this time. I certainly hope I didn't miss any big picture things back in the chat, but I'm seeing something that Elizabeth talked about, this what is wired can be rewired. So that's such a sense of resilience there, and a rethinking around this. The importance of being patient with adolescents, right? Not taking things personally, understanding what's behaviorally sort of expected. Understanding that the nuance between the different ages and ranges of teens and what those things mean. Reminder to be more understanding as well as patient with youth, to listen, to be understanding. Great. Jasmine, we also love to talk about these different stages and breaking them down and understanding through scenarios and reality how these things play out. Great. Yeah, understanding how youth react toward situations, that's part of that developmental sort of behavior. Excellent. And Maggie, I can even understand myself a little bit better. Yeah, this carries out well beyond 26 for those of you who might be in that camp with me. So great. Well, thank you so much for those little pearls of wisdom and things that you're taking with you. I will turn things back for just a few seconds with Maggie, but we did want to make sure that both Elizabeth and I's contact information is there. And certainly we can share some other resources with you as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claire and Elizabeth. I think I speak for everyone when I say this was incredibly informative and a wonderful session. And I loved that little teaser thrown in at the end there about engaging adolescent fathers and fatherhood initiatives. I certainly think that we're very interested in offering up another conversation. And as Elizabeth said, just kind of continuing this work and this conversation. So on behalf of the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative and Prevent Child Abuse New York, I thank you both so very much. B, thank you for handling the tech and for being the producer for this session. If there are any follow-up questions, the contact information for our speakers is on the screen there. And as I said, I will be in touch with follow-up email with the resources from today's presentation, and again, a link to that survey for our federal grant requirements that we would so appreciate you filling out. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and close out this webinar. We will be in touch with a link to the recording, and thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.